right. Hello,
Yeah.
everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to be able to invite you to this event on Listening to the Zoo with Dr. Tom Rice, who is a lecturer in anthropology from the University of Exeter. Please make yourself comfortable, grab some tea or something stronger, depending on which time zone or mood you're in. And I hope you enjoy this event. My name is Tiamat Horda. I'm a PhD candidate in anthrozoology at University of Exeter, and I will be moderating this event as part of the Animals and Biodiversity Think Tank program. It is hosted by the Global Research Network with the support and assistance of the 3 other lovely junior fellows, some of whom are here with us today, as well as the associate members from the Animals and Biodiversity Think Tank program, who have helped incredibly in the promotion of this event. We are so happy to have you all join us today, both here on Zoom, but also on the YouTube live stream. The idea with this event is to not only listen for, but also discuss the ways in which we might understand the lived experiences of other species, specifically those living in zoos in this case, through sound. And Dr. Tom Rice is highly knowledgeable on this topic, focusing on the anthropology of sound and of the senses, auditory culture, and having taught bioacoustics as part of an anthrozoology program at the University of Exeter in the past as well. And the particular focus today actually stems from research starting in 2018 that Dr. Tom Rice has conducted with colleagues at the University of Exeter, including Dr. Alex Badman-King, Professor Samantha Hearn, and Dr. Paul Rose, as well as Dr. Adam Reed, a social anthropologist from St. Andrews. And this was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council's Transforming Social Science Research Call, and is entitled Listening to the Zoo, hence the name of this event. I will refrain, of course, from offering too much more detail here, as I'm sure Dr. Rice will go into some detail in this regard. If you did not see or were perhaps unable to yet read the recently published articles as part of this research, we will share links in the chat, and you can also find those posted on both of our Twitter and Facebook platforms. I would like to thank Dr. Tom Rice for being here today to share this research with us, and for many, I'm sure, spark consideration for an area of human-animal interactions which is often overlooked or not listened to, perhaps we can say. So I will give the floor to Dr. Tom Rice for their talk, followed by a discussion. And if you have any questions at all, please do write them down in the chat and they will be addressed after the talk. This event is also being recorded and will be made public on the GRN's, the Global Research Network's YouTube channel, along with all of their previous wonderful events, very worthwhile checking out on a wide range of topics. So if you would not like to appear in that recording, please do just turn off your camera. I would also like to ask everyone to ensure that you are muted, especially in an event like this that has so much to do with listening and sound, unless asked to unmute, of course, to formulate a question later on. And with that, we are very, very happy to have you here today, Dr. Rice. The floor is now yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much for attending, everyone. And thank you very much, Tiamat, for inviting me to give this presentation. The purpose is really just to tell you a little bit more about the Listening to the Zoo project that Tiamat mentioned. As I was preparing for today, I just jotted a few things down. I wanted to get a sense of what I felt the important sort of take home should be from the presentation. And I put together this slide. I apologize for my very, very basic PowerPoint skills. But I felt the presentation would have been a success if it leaves people better informed about and with a better understanding of this project. Really importantly, too, that it opens up channels for further conversations, both in the chat immediately after and in taking questions immediately after. And in the future, I'll hand you my email address so that you can contact me. I also really hope that the project will inspire people to engage with some of the project outputs, which I'll talk about a little bit in more detail later. So a really important output that I just wanted to draw your attention to, and I'll keep reminding you about this one, it is an audio piece that we've created as part of the project. It's a 15-minute audio piece, an experimental listening tour of an imaginary zoo. And it's informed by some of the really important ideas that surfaced during the project. It's available to listen to on SoundCloud, and I really wanted to point you in that direction. It's a little piece that I feel really proud of, and I think is a really important output from the project. So what do I want to do over the next over the course of the presentation? I want to just do a few very simple things. I want to just introduce myself, the team, and the project in general terms. I want to talk about the core motivating project concept, and then talk a little bit about each of the sub-projects. We constructed 4 sub-projects as a way of answering the sort of overriding questions. And I want to talk you through each of those and just explain what we did. And also, I hope that throughout the presentation, I'll just be issuing sets of provocations. So things that'll help you, I hope, think about the zoo as a sound environment, and think about zoos in ways you haven't before, very simply. So yeah, those won't, although I've named them last in the presentation, I'll hopefully be sort of littering the presentation with them, so they'll come in at various points. And I actually thought the most sensible thing would be for us to start with some listening. So what I'm going to do is play you 6 very short pieces of audio, one after the other. These are snippets of sound recordings that I made myself in Bristol Zoo in the southwest of England in the UK in 2018. And I know quite often there's a big temptation when you're doing something on sound to play a sound and say, you know, see if you can guess what it is. I'm not going to do that. I think that's a very tough thing to do. I don't think people can be expected just to sort of listen to something and then sort of imagine what it might be. So what I'm going to do is tell you first what each of the recordings is, and then we'll have a listen to it. And then I'll talk a little bit about why I find each of them interesting. And hopefully that'll just get us into the sort of mindset of thinking about sound in the zoo, and thinking about the zoo as a sonic space. And also thinking, as Tim mentioned, a little bit about how the zoo might be a sound environment for the animals that inhabit it, as well as for the people who visit and work there. So let's see if this works. The first, sorry.
Sorry,
Yeah.
just sorry to rudely interrupt you right there. I think the slides aren't moving in the screen share.
Okay.
What we do right now is the rhino video still.
Oh, you have that? Yeah, that's not.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to draw your attention to that.
No, sure. It says my screen sharing is paused. Why is that?
Would you like to perhaps try to unshare and share again?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
I can see that now.
So that was the last slide I just mentioned. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Is it working okay?
For me, it is. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to play these 6 little snippets of audio. Okay. So the first one is a group of flamingos feeding in an enclosure in Bristol Zoo. The second one is a group of keas calling to each other. Keas are, I'm sure many of you know about keas, but they're parrots from New Zealand. Visually not particularly impressive, sort of grey, greeny colour, but with a very conspicuous call. Then the third piece is going to be quite a strange recording of the sound of a brass instrument, a trumpet, a trombone, I'm not quite sure which, drifting over from the music school, which is adjacent to the zoo. So yeah, Bristol Zoo is surrounded on 3 sides by a big school. And at one point, the music block is right next to the zoo wall, which creates some interesting sound events, some interesting kind of things happening as people practice and as concerts are performed and that kind of thing. The next one I'm going to play you is a recording from a pygmy hippo enclosure. You can hear the pygmy hippo surfacing, but you'll also be able to hear the clicking of an electric fence, which contains the hippo. The fifth sound is of one of those kind of little kids' playground rides where you put some coins in and then the child gets in and the thing moves, accompanied by some sound for a minute or so, or the ride takes a minute or so. It's just a short snippet in this recording. And then the sixth one is of an enclosure of black-cheeked lovebirds in their enclosure alongside a children's playground, which is also within the zoo. So let's hope this works. I'll give it a go. Okay, so hopefully you're able to hear those okay. So I just say a few things that very simply about them. I think the Flamingo recordings are really interesting because obviously flamingos have a very strong visual identity. They're sort of visually striking. They're very distinctively colored, of course. But in this recording, you also get a sense of the honking sounds that they make and also the strength of that sound that's produced as they filter feed and filter nutrients from the water in their pool with their beaks. And that's just a sort of emblematic recording, I think, to sort of, as I say, get people thinking acoustically. That whereas the flamingos might be quite iconic visually, we don't think about in quite the same way about their sonic identities. And probably you had a less clearly formed idea of the sonic identity of the flamingo, both prior to that recording and probably now too. In the case of the Kias, they were calling in that recording, obviously, but I think they also emphasize something really important, which is that they're loud, they're audible beyond the zoo, and they're also audible across the zoo, both to visitors and to other animals. And I think they just underline the point that very often connections that are made through sound aren't also connections visually. So you're conscious of the Kias a lot of the time in the zoo, even when they're not visually present to you. And this must also be true for a lot of animal species in the zoo. In the music school recording, I think that's also an interesting recording because we tend to think of that as being sort of strange or out of place in the zoo context. But if you take on board the ideas of, say, a philosopher and experimental musician like, say, Mark Rothenberg, who's written a number of books about whale song, about bird song, about insect sound, he argues that we should consider these animal sounds to be music in their own right, because these sounds are structurally and melodically similar in some ways to human music, but because, as well as being produced for reasons of to attract mates or to protect territory or to mark territory, that bird songs are also, for example, insect songs are also produced simply for the hell of it, really, for pure enjoyment, for pleasure, or at least this is what he maintains in relation to animal sounds of various kinds. So that instead of seeing human music and animal sound as being distinct and separate, that we should see them as continuations of one another. So that rather than being a very strange sound, one that's very out of place in the zoo, we can actually see this as a point of sonic continuity. In the pygmy hippo enclosure recording, again, I think this is interesting. There's the striking sound of the hippo surfacing, but also that strange metallic sort of electronic click that accompanies that features in the recording. And I just think it's really interesting how the equipment that's functioning to contain and to constrain or restrain the pygmy hippo here is audible in a really interesting way. Zoos often seek to downplay the presence of these structures of containment and do not deliberately draw attention to them. But I think it's interesting how nonetheless they sort of resurface at various points, and here they're surfacing sort of sonically. And it's interesting too that this sound, this clicking sound, is continually in the presence of the pygmy hippo. It's continually audible to the hippo. A visitor might not notice it, but interestingly, that clicking sound also serves as a kind of reassuring purpose for zookeepers. They like hearing that sound because it reminds them that the equipment, that the fence is working okay. So sounds take on different meanings for different actors in the zoo setting. And so I think that sound recording illustrates that quite nicely. Had I been there a little bit earlier, that recording was made right at the end of the zoo day, but had I been there slightly earlier, I would have also heard factored into that acoustic mix a kind of jungle sound effect that's played in that space. And again, you have a really strange set of meanings linked to that. The jungle soundscape, which probably isn't consistent in any way with the natural biomes in which pygmy hippos are found, but nonetheless is serving to create a sort of atmosphere and produce a sense of otherness and of being somewhere different for the visitors. But again, not necessarily serving any sort of distinct purpose for the hippo. Then in the ride-on, I just think that's also a really interesting recording in its own way, because although it's very simple, zoos nowadays are often pointing to their credentials in terms of conservation education and teaching environmentally responsible behaviors. But zoos have this heritage of being places of entertainment, and indeed they partly continue to function as places of entertainment, and lots of their visitors are, after all, children, and they feel a strong need to entertain and interest children and their parents. So you have an interesting thing. You have these ride-on, you have playgrounds, and they have a particular distinct sort of sonic heritage and sonic characteristics of their own that, again, might well seem out of place in a zoo setting. Like this recording that I made was, the ride-on, the toy here is right next to an enclosure for primates, for oh my goodness, I can't remember, for spider monkeys, I'm sorry, and also lion-tailed macaques are very close by. So it seems strangely out of place in their sonic environment. In fact, in recent months, that has been moved, that toy, so it isn't actually there anymore, but nonetheless, it was there and describes a particular part of the zoo's function, which isn't necessarily consistent with contemporary ideas about zoos and their role in, as I've said, education and conservation. And the last one is just the lovebirds, a group of, say, 40 or so lovebirds next to a children's playground. And I just think they make an interesting sonic juxtaposition. So is this just simply the juxtaposition of two noisy species, black-cheeked lovebirds and human children? Or so is there a sort of acoustic similarity there that might not be obvious visually? But at the same time, visitors we spoke to explained that they thought it was interesting that while the people could walk away from the black-cheeked lovebird enclosure, which they often found quite noisy, that the lovebirds didn't have the same option when it came to being adjacent to the playground. And obviously that playground was at quite a low level of use at that particular point. So I hope those are just a bunch of sort of provocations, as I've said, to get you thinking about zoo sound. Now I'm hoping to move on and just show you one more little video made by Sam Hearn, one of my colleagues on the project, just on her phone. Yeah, so this is a white rhino. They're known to be a very sonically sensitive species. And in fact, there is a sign in the visitor's enclosure, explaining that they are very sound sensitive and asking for quiet. But just watch the rhino's ears here. So yeah, I just love the way that the ears sort of describe so clearly the way that attention is moving around, and the auditory focus is moving and changing direction. But I think they also gesture to the extent to which zoos in the sound environments of zoos present particular acoustic challenges for some species that are housed in them. Again, this is a really good example because they're known to be so sound sensitive. But it's interesting too that just some of the sound produced by the children in this recording is actually talking about the importance of being quiet. So it's an interesting little sort of irony within that, I think. Okay, so moving on from those sort of provocations, Tiamat's already introduced the fundamentals really, but I'll just recap them as I have the slides here. So this presentation is obviously about the Listening to the Zoo project. I'm Tom Rice. I'm a lecturer in anthropology at the University of Exeter in the UK. Please make a note of my email address in case you need to contact me at any point. And I've also included the details of my research profile there. So the focus of my research is, surprise, surprise, sound and auditory knowledge and auditory culture. So all that means really is that I study sound and sonic experience, which I think is a really important aspect, or is acknowledged to be an important aspect of everyday human life. And I think about and research the ways in which sound is produced and perceived and interpreted in different cultural settings. So I work within a sub sort of discipline or a sub area of anthropology known as the Anthropology of Sound. And the Anthropology of Sound sits within a broader subdiscipline, which is the Anthropology of the Senses. The fundamental idea underpinning the Anthropology of the Senses is that sensory perception is a cultural as well as a purely physical or sort of neurological act or process. So the ways in which the senses are directed, the value that's accorded to particular types of sensory experience varies across cultures and across history, and is available to study and has significance for how we understand human life as lived in different contexts. My work also sits within sound studies more generally. Sound studies is a vast interdisciplinary field now. Over the last 20 years, it's become absolutely huge, and it receives contributions from people working in disciplines right across the arts and the social sciences and the humanities, as well as from numerous more traditionally scientific disciplines. Basically, any research which makes a contribution to the knowledge and understanding of sound can be understood to be making a contribution to sound studies. So that's really sort of where I sit in a sort of disciplinary sense. It's also sort of explains some of the sort of origins of the project in terms of the sort of intellectual underpinnings that it has. Now, I've tended to write about institutions in the past. So I did a big project on sound in hospitals, looking at patient experiences of hospital sound environments, looking at the way that nurses use sound and listening on wards to manage patients and to manage the process of caring, looking at the way that doctors use sound and listening in their diagnostic work. And that culminated in this book, Hearing in the Hospital. I've also written on prisoner experiences of prison sound environments. So in 2016, I published this piece, which is an analysis of references to sound and music in a set of prison diaries. I've listed them here. But I use these references to sound to give a sense of how prisons in the UK between sort of roughly 1996 and 2003 sound and the kind of sonic issues that prisoners face during their incarceration. I've also written a little bit on sound in psychiatric institutions, and now I'm working on zoos. And I guess you could say that my sort of underpinning interest there is in captive audiences. I'm interested in situations where people have no choice but to be immersed in a particular set of sounds, and they are therefore forced into an engagement with a particular set of sonic conditions. And that's what I think led me on to be so interested in the zoo, because I do understand zoo animals also to be a captive audience and to be obliged to cope with a particular set of acoustic conditions in the zoo, which, as I've suggested, particularly with that white rhino video, in some senses can be challenging, or does present challenges. But I'm also very interested in animal sound worlds, and on a couple of occasions I've taught a module on bioacoustics as part of the MA in human-animal interactions, or anthrozoology, at the University of Exeter. I know that Tiamat is a graduate of that course, and she actually did my bioacoustics module back in the day. What do I mean by bioacoustics? Well, I don't know if there is an accepted definition or not, but what I really mean is, when I refer to bioacoustics, is the study of the sound worlds of non-human or other than human animals that I'm referring to in this presentation simply as animals. So if, for example, a person's researching the way that songbirds are obliged to alter their song patterns when they're living in the near busy roads, for instance, that would be a piece of bioacoustics research. If you're studying the way that wild gibbons call to each other and the purpose of that calling, that would also be bioacoustics. If you're studying the way that elephants communicate across large different distances with their calls, albeit partly at an infrasonic, rather, at a range below human hearing, that would also be sort of bioacoustics. If you're studying the way pandas respond to the noise produced by alterations happening to their enclosure or to an enclosure near them, that would also be sort of come under the bioacoustics. So that interest of mine really informs this zoo project also. So the project, as Tiamat mentioned, was funded by the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, under their Transforming Social Science research call. Though we had actually been sort of building up the project in the years prior to that, first starting in 2016. Obviously, I'm PI on this project, but my collaborators are, as Tiamat mentioned, Alex Badman-King, philosopher, anthropologist, anthrozoologist at Exeter University, Sam Hearn, an anthrozoologist at Exeter, Dr. Paul Rose, an expert in animal behaviour, also at Exeter University, and Adam Reed, a social anthropologist from St Andrews. And we were also working with two partner zoos, Bristol Zoo in the southwest UK and Paynton Zoo, also in the southwest of the UK. And they gave us access to their collections, obviously, for us to do sort of listening exercises, for Paul to do observational research. They allowed us to talk to all their staff members. They basically facilitated the research. So I'm really grateful to them, and I'd like that to be, that's an important thing for me to say as part of the presentation. So the core idea behind this project is that in social science discourse in general, zoos have often been conceptualized as places of spectacle. So they're places where animals are exhibited and displayed to a visiting public. So if I was to ask you, or you were to ask somebody else why they go to the zoo, they'd probably say to see the animals. And that is a gesture towards that sort of ocular-centric, visualist sort of route that underpins zoos. They are places at which animals are displayed, as I've suggested, to a viewing public. And some zoo critics, for instance, have suggested that vision is a sense of distance and detachment, and that creates particular relationships between the visiting public and the animals on display. So once again, that relationship is characterized by distance, detachment, a tendency to objectify the animal. And some theorists have suggested that these scopic regimes which underpin zoos are also patriarchal and colonialist in essence. They're about the demonstrating power and domination over an exotic other, and that visuality is kind of fundamentally sort of bound up in that process. So our aim really was just to move academic discourse around zoos in a different direction. We hoped that by asking or by looking at sound as a way of opening up the sort of multisensoriality of zoos, that we'd be able to generate a different set of perspectives, essentially. So the project has these two fundamental research questions. What is the role, or what are the roles of sound in the multi-species environment that the zoo represents? What are the particularities of sound as a medium for human-animal interactions in the zoo setting? So our aim is not at all to sort of polarize vision and hearing and to emphasize their separateness, because in reality, the interplay between the two of them is very close. And zoos have never been a purely sort of visual experience, and we're not trying to suggest otherwise. We're really just trying to explore whether thinking through sound gives us new perspectives on the zoo, and importantly, to produce a multi-species perspective. So to ensure that the zoo is also understood as an animal sound world as much as it might be a human one. So in order to address these kind of underpinning research questions, we constructed 4 sub-projects. So in sub-project 1, we look to use phonological research methods. I'll say a bit about what those are in a moment, but they're very, very simple, but it's a term used by Michael Gallagher and Jonathan Pryor to refer to doing things with sound, basically listening, sound recording, sound walking, as a way to engage with the environment, basically. So we were using these phonological research methods to try to understand the zoo as a sound environment, and we conducted, as Gallagher and Pryor suggested, sound walks, listening exercises, and sound recordings in the zoo to identify important sonic sites and to identify interesting sonic species that are interesting from a sound point of view, whether that be through their powers of acoustic perception or whether that be through the sound that they produce, or both. But yes, to identify important sonic sites and important species or individual animals within these 2 partner zoos with which we were working. We also conducted semi-structured interviews, guided conversations with zookeepers, with research staff, and with zoo visitors to find out about how the members of these different groups hear the zoo, and importantly, how they imagine animals hear it. So as well as asking them to give their perspective, we were also sort of offering, again, this term, sort of provocations, offering provocations to encourage people to think differently about the space that they occupy, and to start to think in empathetic ways about how what the sound lives of animals in zoos might be like. In the second sub-project, we considered how thinking through sound might complicate zoo boundaries and enclosure boundaries. So let me illustrate what I mean by that. So here's a Google map of an area of Bristol called Clifton. The zoo is sited in Clifton Village, and it's right here. I don't know if you can see the cursor moving around. Tim, are you able to see that where I'm pointing?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. And again, you can see that's quite a neatly visually demarcated space. And again, if you take the Bristol Zoo's visitor map, once again, the space is very clearly sort of outlined. Now, if we think through sound, we get a very different sense of the space. Basically, zoo boundaries are very porous. when it comes to thinking through sound. So by way of a somewhat cliched example, if we take the roar of the Asiatic lions in this closure here, that's a sound that can be heard sometimes several miles away. And if we take the calling of the gibbons, for example, another very loud sound, then that also dissipates a very long way. So the sonic sphere of influence of the zoo is actually much larger than this visual map would suggest. Equally, if we think about the way that zoo animals perceive sound, some species will also be perceptive to sounds leaking across these boundaries. We might think of the lions and the gibbons, or the gorillas being another good example. So yeah, just to underscore the sort of porosity of these zoo boundaries. I can say much more about this. We might think, for example, again, of how on this map, the enclosure boundaries are very neatly demarcated. But of course, we know that the flamingos, for example, here near the zoo entrance, are completely audible to the lions. And that the keas, for example, will be audible to all kinds of animals across this space. We can also think about how thinking acoustically might sort of produce other very kind of small sonic worlds. So if we think about the sort of the reptiles in the reptile center up here in the top left-hand corner, for example, well, their auditory worlds might not span much beyond their glass tank, their glass vivarium in which they're kept, maybe just beyond it, but probably not much. And we might even start thinking about whether sound is really a good way to understand their experience, and whether we shouldn't be thinking about sound in a more inclusive way as a kind of vibration, and whether we should switch to a more sort of vibrational understanding of the experience of some kinds of animals. Now, I mentioned how the boundaries of the zoo are porous from sound. One of the things we were really interested to do as part of this project was to talk to zoo neighbours about how they perceive the sound environment. But actually, it was really interesting because the zoos were not keen for us to do this, as they both had outstanding complaints about noise from some of their neighbours. And so, for example, the gibbons at the Bristol Zoo were actually under an ASBO, an antisocial behaviour order, which meant they had to be confined to their enclosure, kept inside in the early mornings on a couple of days a week, because that would make them less likely to vocalize. They vocalize in the mornings. And that would mean that there'd be a reduction in the noise, which the neighbors would have to endure. And I always found that really interesting, because these neighbors have some right of complaint, despite the zoo having been here since 1834, and presumably animals of various kinds inhabiting this space since then. And yet the gibbons have no right of complaint over the sounds to which they might be exposed, be they from outside or inside the zoo. So I thought that was a really interesting little asymmetry that thinking about that particular sound produced. Interestingly, at Paynton Zoo, their lions, their Asiatic lions, are very audible, and when they roar. And it was interesting that we found a sort of counter narrative to the sort of noise nuisance idea, that local people were actually quite proud of the sound of this sound, quite enjoyed being able to hear it, and were able to say, oh yes, that's Lucifer the lion, I know that sound. When they were visiting the supermarket, which is right alongside the zoo, they were able to experience it too. And so it had a different quality. It was kind of a community sound mark, something the community sort of gathered around, and as I say, of which they were proud. So, yeah. That was just a way, so thinking about the zoo spatially through sound was really interesting, and created a new sort of set of perspectives on the space. It was also interesting, sort of noted by the keepers, that sound spaces were taken into consideration when they were thinking about where animals were housed. So if they'd noticed, for example, that two bird species seemed to antagonize one another, they'd moved them to sufficiently far apart that they felt their noise could no longer be a point of antagonism. If, for example, the silverback gorilla Jock seemed to be irritated by the noise made by the sound of the beeping of trucks made in reverse by delivery vans, in this case, bringing things, transporting things around the zoo. They tried to keep that sound away from him. So it's interesting the way the space was sonically zoned by the keepers in the interests of creating sound environments which were at least livable to the animals in question. So moving on to the third sub-project, this was library research and ethological observation, so that's observations of animal behavior, to generate understanding of how particular species hear the zoo, what sounds they find interesting, are frightened of or distressed by, how they make sound among themselves, as well as in response to others in the zoo, keepers, visitors, other animals, and so on. So this was where sort of Paul took the lead. He made observations of flamingos, tried to saw if there were associations to be drawn between the animal's behavior and their sound environment. He also observed bird species in other enclosures, looking, for example, at whether visitors' sound could be linked in any reliable ways to potentially negative behaviors in the species in question. We also did a great deal of library research, and there is a surprising amount of bioacoustical research out there on the ways in which zoo sound functions, or rather the way in which zoo sound is experienced by particular species. There are some arguments that a certain amount of visitor noise, for example, is stimulating for particular species of animals. The general sense, though, is that for mammals especially, visitor noise, especially loud and sudden sounds, have a negative impact on sort of animal well-being. And the fourth sub-projects and final sub-projects were an opportunity to have some fun, something that's not talked about much in academic research, but is actually really, really important. I'm actually really conscious that it's getting very dark behind me, but I think if I stop to sort of mess around with the lights, it'll disrupt things. So I'm just going to carry on and yeah, just continue to be a sort of ghostly presence on the screen, if that's okay. So what we did as part of the fourth sub-project was a set of experimental zoo visits. Firstly, we got two groups of volunteer participants to take part in some silent zoo visits, where they would go around the zoo for an hour and a half on their own. They could go wherever they liked. The only condition of it was that they were silent, didn't speak to others, and used the time to reflect on the sound environment of the zoo. And we were really interested in finding out whether silence was conducive to more respectful and receptive modes of engagement with the species on display in the zoo. We also conducted a set of sound walk visits. This is where volunteer participants, again, were led on tour. Well, this time they weren't allowed to go around the zoo on their own. They were led on a listening tour, which I led, and Sam and Alex were also involved in. So leading these volunteer participants around the zoo and doing sets of listening exercises to direct their attention specifically to the sound environment, but also to get them to engage with, to do listening exercises which might encourage a more empathetic sort of engagement with the animals, encouraging them to imagine the animals' sonic surroundings, and getting them to reflect on anthropogenic, that is, man-made sounds in the zoo space. And it's getting so dark I can't see my own notes, so that might become a bit of a barrier to progress here. Yeah, so we led these participants around the zoo, and we conducted these variety of listening exercises. I'm going to do some of those listening exercises with you in just a moment, but we were interested fundamentally in whether listening reconfigures conventional relationships between visitors and animals in the zoo context. As I say, the convention is for this visual engagement. So does embracing an unconventional mode of engagement, this time visiting, produce new forms of experience, produce new ways of relating to the animals on display? So in these listening visits and in the script that we used, the listening exercises that we conducted, We were basically drawing on insights from zoology, from animal behavior, from bioacoustics research, to try to stimulate thought about the way in which human and animal sound worlds might overlap and intersect in the zoo, as well as differ. And we sought to raise consciousness of the auditory sensitivities and capabilities of animals as a route to encouraging, as I say, these more empathetic encounters between humans and other animals. We were using sound and listening as routes to the promotion of good environmental citizenship and interspecies etiquette in the zoo setting. So I'm going to finish very soon, but I just thought before I do, I'd try to conduct some listening exercises with you, or just give you some examples of the kind of thing that we did with these participants in these experimental listening visits. Before I do, though, I just point you to some the outputs that Tiamat mentioned. This first piece, which is just out this week, Listening After the Animals, Sound and Pastoral Care in the Zoo, is really about zookeeper listening and the ways in which they attend to the sound environment and the sounds of their animals as a way of looking after them, something which I'm sure we can all relate to if we keep animals ourselves, or if we have responsibility for human children, or even sort of complicated pieces of machinery. But then the article opens up to think about the ways that zookeepers are also listening to zoo visitors and trying to ensure that visitors don't do things like bang on the glass or shout at animals or otherwise sort of antagonize them. And it considers the way zookeepers interact with the public, but also the way that signage is used to try to cultivate good interspecies etiquette, a phrase I've already used, between animals and the visitors. So, for example, if I just duck forward a slide, here are examples of some signs. The first one at Bristol Zoo: please do not knock or tap on this glass. I'm sure we're all very familiar with that sort of sign. The one at the top in the middle, I think, is more revealing. Please don't bang on the glass. Thank you. It scares the keepers. I think that's probably quite revealing and spot on, basically. Regardless of what the animals think, the keepers really don't like it. But here we also see some more differently phrased signs that invite visitors to try to imagine what the animals might be hearing. These animals are sensitive to loud noises. Please be as quiet as possible. That's in the ape house at Paynton Zoo. This one is difficult to read at the top here, but I think it says, quiet please, these animals are very sensitive to noise and are easily disturbed. I think that's what it says, or easily frightened. So that's outside the white rhino enclosure at Paynton Zoo. Or, shush please, it's the breeding season for our Sumatran laughing thrushes and they're sensitive to disturbance. Enjoy watching them quietly, thank you. So this is partly about the way that visitors are being directed to sort of monitor their own acoustic behaviors in the presence of animals. So that's one of the papers we've produced. The second, this piece, Listening to the Zoo, Challenging Zoo Visiting Conventions, in the center there, is a write-up of the experimental listening visits that we conducted, and including the participants' responses to being involved in that. So that's a full sort of write-up of that aspect of the project. We also have a piece by Paul Rose, which he led on, which is his examination of how, of whether the changes in the zoo soundscape could be linked to enclosure usage by captive flamingos. So again, expanding the sort of multi-species sound environment study that we were trying to conduct. And also just to remind you of that audio piece, which is another of our outputs, this experimental listening tool, which draws on a lot of the listening exercises that we used in these experimental listening visits, and some of which I'll talk through with you now and try you on now. Yeah, this audio piece really condenses a lot of sort of important project findings. Okay, so here's part of the text that we used in one of our listening visits. So I can't actually see the entire thing because of this bar here. I'm going to move that over like that. Yeah. So both of the zoos in which we conducted the project had Western lowland gorillas in their collections. And so when the listening visit sort of was led through the viewing areas for the Western lowland gorillas, we stopped and did this listening exercise. Perhaps you can see one of the gorillas, perhaps not, it doesn't matter. We just need to be conscious that the gorillas are nearby. A gorilla's outer ear looks very similar to a human's, and the workings of the inner ear are similar too. These gorillas hear very much as we do, at frequencies between approximately 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz, or 20,000 hertz. Sorry, I've made a mistake there. It's 20,000 hertz, not 20,000 kilohertz. Anyway, what do you think these gorillas can hear now? Try to imagine. What sounds do you think they hear when they wake up in the morning, in the middle of the day, before they go to sleep at night? You might think that a gorilla's natural or preferred sound environment would be like that of the African forests where these gorillas are found in the wild. But these particular gorillas do not live in these forests. Their natural sound environment is the one they're hearing now. The sounds you make are part of that environment. So again, trying to use information about the kind of hearing capacities of the gorillas, so imparting sort of basic information, but at the same time asking visitors to sort of listen empathetically alongside the gorillas. So rather than sort of looking at them, there was a sense that they might be listening with them in a more sort of related to them in a more sort of participatory way, on something approximating a more sort of a more equal sensory footing. And also, what was I going to? Yes, just by turning the sort of experience back on the visitors, you know, the sounds you make are part of that environment. Again, trying to encourage responsible visitor behavior in the zoo setting, and asking people to reflect on the role of on anthropogenic sound in the zoo space. So that's one of those. In another part of the listening tour in Bristol Zoo, the tour went through an enclosure where African penguins are housed. And again, the participants were asked to listen to the sound environment there for a while. But we were also stopped, we stopped to examine particularly this information board, which shows two photographs, the one on the left taken in the 1930s, and the one on the right taken in 2004 on Halifax Island off Namibia. And it shows the complete local extinction of the African penguin population there. But in this listening exercise, which again I'll show you in just a moment, we were really using sound to bring people to reflect on the value and the fragility of biodiversity, to encourage them to think about extinction. And yeah, when we think about extinction, we often think about disappearance, and a visual root metaphor is used, disappearance. Whereas actually when something disappears, it also falls silent. So that's another way of sort of stimulating people to think about biodiversity loss. I'm going to just try and move forward a slide. Yeah. As you'll see in the text, I'm going to pretty much exactly repeat what I just said, but when a species dies out, it falls silent. So sound provides a powerful way to draw attention to the value and fragility of biodiversity. African penguins make a range of vocalizations, some of which you might be able to hear. They're renowned for their donkey-like bray. Here is an information board showing the seemingly total loss of African penguins from Halifax Island, Namibia, between the 1930s and 2004. The population was estimated at 4 million 200 years ago. There are now about 40,000 of them in the wild. Imagine the breadth and volume of the sound of a colony, a full colony, as we see in the image. Then imagine that chorus very gradually fading to silence, a 70-year fade. This is perhaps a good way to sonically describe the depletion of a population. So again, asking people to think sonically as a sort of, also giving them information about sort of biodiversity loss, but about sort of bioacoustical considerations. We're thinking about the vocalizations of these penguins. But then, yeah, using this device of the 70-year fade to think about population depletion. And I'll do one more before I stop. In both of the listening visits, we stopped, the final listening station, as it were, was the Asiatic lion enclosures. Each zoo had an enclosure of, had a number of Asiatic lions. And you might think that the lion's roar would be an obvious place to start a listening tour, but actually we felt that that would be too much of a cliche, and we wanted actually to sort of allow other sounds to come to the fore. So we finished with the lions. But here's the text, and here's what was read to the participants. A lion's roar is a very noticeable sound here in the zoo. When the zoo is busy and the lion roars, people hear it and then rush over to the enclosure. The roar is an iconic symbol of the lion. For us, that sound means lion. We often see children here roaring at the lions. But this is a considerable abbreviation and even a caricature of the lion's vocal repertoire. Lions make a variety of vocalizations: meows, roars, moans, howls, snarls, puffs, hums, puffs, and woofs. Females roar less often than males, but do so nonetheless. If we think of the roar not in isolation, but more as one of the sounds a lion makes, a sound among other sounds, then we can start thinking of a lion as more complex and expressive than just an animal that roars. Lions also have very acute hearing. So what is the sonic exchange here? Among other sounds, lions are roaring, but what sounds are humans putting in? Sounds help us realize that there are relationships at a distance between people and animals. So once more, using bioacoustical sort of information about vocalizations, but also about the sensitivity of lions, thinking about the cultural significance of the lion's roar in contemporary society. Might think about the sort of Disneyfication of the lion's roar, for instance. You know, features on so many films, for example. But also, again, turning the situation back, using it as a way of thinking, you know, okay, so lions are roaring, what sounds are humans putting in? And inviting participants to think really about what they think good zoo visitor behavior would consist of, and what a good zoo sound environment would be. Okay, I think that's all from me. I think I'm going to stop there. And as I say, I want to just come back to my these were the sort of things I'd noted would be important to cover, and I'd know if the presentation had been a success if it had done these things. Hopefully you feel now better informed and have a better understanding of the project. Hopefully we can carry on further conversations, and hopefully you'll feel inspired to engage with some of our project outputs. I think I'm going to stop there. I might also turn some lights on because it's awfully dark in here.
Yeah, feel free to. Thank you so much for a really, really wonderful talk. This is an area of research that I really find endlessly fascinating ever since, like you mentioned, I took your module on bioacoustics back in the day. And it has really shifted how I perceive this impact of sound and of listening to sound. We do already have a couple questions coming in, predominantly from YouTube. So please feel free to write any further questions in the chat. But as folks are sort of contemplating and formulating their questions in the chat box, I will selfishly perhaps get us started with a question of my own. I was wondering, you know, as someone who has had such extensive prior knowledge of bioacoustics and so on, sort of before, you know, venturing out in this research and all of that and collecting the data, with this developed awareness of soundscapes and so on, did this research have an impact on how you move through zoos or other multi-species spaces? And also sort of as an extension of that, did you draw any unexpected parallels between animals living in zoos versus, you know, humans or other animals in other institutions, such as you mentioned hospitals or prisons and so on, sort of along the lines of, you mentioned antisocial behavior order. I don't know if it was the ASBO or ASBO or how you,
yeah,
that was called, but sort of almost seen as this, like, it seems like kind of like a social isolation for what humans might perceive as misbehaving or disrupting and so on. So any thoughts on that would be interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, it's certainly changed the way I move around zoo spaces and the way I engage with them. And I hope, and the sort of evidence is that it has also changed the way in which those participants on these various experimental visits also engage with these kinds of spaces. It's hard for me to say sort of precisely how, because I think I've always, or for a very long time now anyway, like listened very carefully or tried to listen very carefully wherever I am. But, you know, actually what I've just said is also sort of total nonsense. You know, one of the things I found very strange about the project is that, well, here I am, a guy in his 40s, hanging around the zoo sort of on his own. That's something that never happens. People go around the zoo with their kids and they are obliged to sort of run after them, and they're like, I want to see this, I want to see that, and you're sort of following after them. And I've had that experience too. It's very unusual for an adult to be able to have time to sort of listen and reflect in a space like a zoo. So I guess the answer to your question is it sort of depends. Like, if I'm in a sort of parenting mode, I probably don't have the opportunity to do that sort of to engage with the space through careful auditory attention. But it's something I definitely do when I'm able to and when I have opportunities. But I don't, apart from sort of monitoring my own sort of volume in those kinds of spaces, I don't know that it's sort of changed my behavior sort of fundamentally. I hope that's an answer to that first part of the question. I don't know.
Yeah.
And then were there connections between sort of animals and sort of, or were there strong connections between animals in zoos and other sort of institutional environments? I mean, I think I'm really struck by sort of this, as I sort of mentioned in reference to the sort of the clicking of the electric fence, how audible the sort of architecture of constraint is. So not just in terms of clicking electric fences, but also if you think about as the animals move around, they're moving often through concrete buildings. They're moving through spaces where there are lots of sort of metal structures. And that's reflected in the sound environment too. And, I was in a gorilla viewing enclosure, a gorilla viewing area one time when a gorilla was doing a really intense sort of banging on the, I guess it was glass. But I don't know, there's something about the way the sound then sort of moved around the space, reverberating off the walls and so on, that had a distinctive sort of institutional flavor to it, or an institutional quality to it. I was really struck by that. So I think, the connection really is that, that sound environment reflects a sort of commonality of a commonality in the sort of materiality of spaces of constraint, like prisons, to some extent also like hospitals. Although I think in hospitals, sort of that the constraint is less stark and less sort of obvious, and is much more sort of downplayed. And it should be pointed out that lots of people, talk about things like, I don't know, for example, bars on some primate enclosures are supposed to be really good. They're supposed to be really, really valuable for them as a way of climbing and to allow them to climb, and might be much more useful to them and much more sort of enriching than a glass barrier. So it's tricky, but broadly speaking, I would say just the sort of architectural and materiality of the sound, the architecture and the way it influenced the materiality and the quality of the sound, I think was really striking.
Yeah, that's fascinating, especially that idea of bars in one instance with animals living in zoos being perhaps a beneficial thing, and of course with generally being frowned upon to be behind bars. So it is, I can already see the future research kind of bubbling forth from all of this. It's really fascinating. I guess sort of along that line of institutions and perhaps the stress that beings feel when they're in institutions, we have a question from YouTube from Tanmay Tiwari, and I really hope that I didn't butcher your name, and apologies if I did. They write, "It is often observed that animals in enclosures and zoos experience some kind of stress. Do they produce a certain sound that can help us to detect that?" And just sort of my caveat would be, of course, not to go into each specific species, but I wonder if you sort of, along the lines of with that gorilla, were there any animals that had sort of a striking sound that was a stress identifier, or that you feel happens frequently or something like that?
Yeah, well, certainly the keepers are very highly attuned to what constituted a sort of normal sound environment and what was okay. I don't know why I'm putting those things in speech marks. I'm not suggesting that they're wrong about that necessarily, but they had certain sort of sonic criteria almost for what constitutes sort of normal, routine, even relaxed behavior among particular groups, especially primates. And also some birds, for example. And they were equally sort of aware of when they were of what a negative sound might be like, and of what a rupture in that normal sound environment would be. They were aware of when sort of the interpersonal, for want of a better word, but I think that's actually a fine word, the interpersonal dynamics between animals sharing an enclosure, for example. They were very sort of aware of when of sounds that might indicate that problems were emerging. They talked a lot. I mean, it's very easy to keep falling back on the sort of gorilla example, and I tend to want to resist the temptation to do that, but it does kind of spring to mind that keepers talked a lot about let me get this right. They either grumble when they're stressed or grumble to show that they are feeling relaxed and happy, or they cough. I can't remember which way around it is. One of those signs, the cough, I think, is a sign that things are not all good, and that there's some negativity in the atmosphere. Whereas I think the grumble was a sound of contentment. And so there were, but obviously, if things were, if say, I don't know, there was a squabble between two members in that, two of the individuals in that enclosure, it'd be very distinctly audible, and they'd be able to intervene. They had, so interestingly, the spider monkeys at Bristol Zoo were hand reared at other zoos. And so they had two females who were being brought into contact with two males who had not been hand reared. And so this was quite understandably troubling the females at times. And the keeper was particularly sort of attuned to distress calls that they might make, and would sort of go running and look to sort of calm things down if he heard that. And he was capable of doing, and indeed a lot of the keepers were capable of doing quite good vocal imitations of sounds that might indicate particular things, contentment or distress. So I'm sorry I can't give any more specific examples, but basically there are sort of a number of illustrations, not all of which are right at the top of my head at the moment, I'm afraid.
Oh, that was wonderful. It was really fascinating once again to hear insight on that. So thank you. We have a question, quite a big question, I would say, from Marine Lessier, who's the lead junior fellow for the Animals and Biodiversity Think Tank program. And she wrote, so I'll just read the whole thing sort of to give context. Marine wrote, "Are zoos actively taking the sound environment for different animal species into account in designing their infrastructures? And do we have enough knowledge of what these different animals like, dislike, enjoy, or suffer from as a species, but also as individuals? For example, I may suffer from migraines as an individual and be impacted by the slightest noise, while my neighbor may enjoy loud music. How to accommodate these interspecies, I think the typo there, but also interspecies differences?"
Yeah, I mean, you just hit upon a whole load of really important questions in sort of bioacoustics and in zoo research. Of course, individual animals have very different relationships to particular sounds, conspecifics may react very differently to the same sound environment. And that's something I think is very difficult for zoos to cater for, because the likelihood is that all members of a species in one particular enclosure will share a very similar sound environment, whether that's one they like or appreciate or not. And so I'm going to start at the beginning. Basically, do zoos take this into account in the sound environment into account when they're designing enclosures? And the answer to that is that some of them do, and some don't, and some, although I've got to be really careful what I say. I've only been researching in these two zoos, and so I can't speak for other zoos at all. But certainly these zoos are both cognizant that the sound environment has a definite influence on animal well-being. And I know, for example, that the American Association of Zoos and Aquaria have a number of documents that detail what the sort of the keeping regimen and the architectural environment for particular species should be. It's not exhaustive, but they've done it for I would estimate something between sort of 30 and 50 different species. And in their documentation, they do have, in some species, with regards to some species like gorillas, quite an extensive paragraph about this. And in others where I think less is known about their sonic experience, they have shorter sort of bits of text detailing how sound should be considered as a factor in the construction of an environment where these particular animals are housed. There's the texts in the British for the British Association of the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquaria, I believe is the acronym, BIAZA. They also have, again, text on sort of sonic requirements for some species, but not all. So there's much more to be done there, I think. Yes, but it's much harder, of course, to make allowances for individual animals within an enclosure. And I think that's much harder to do, though there is awareness that, you know, other animals, you know, like humans, their sensory perception varies over the life course, that people have different, I don't know, might have hyperacusis, which is a very hypersensitivity to sound that causes pain. You know, there's awareness that there might be, some animals might be deaf or hard of hearing. There's an awareness that some animals have complicated relationships with particular sounds. So, and there is sort of some, I have seen pieces of bioacoustical research, for instance, on pods of captive dolphins that suggest that, you know, oh, this member of this group might be particularly sonically receptive and the others have are less kind of receptive at different sort of frequencies and at different volumes. So there is some sort of insight into this, but it's quite an early stage, I would say.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you for that insight. There are two more questions. Well, there's two questions that I'm going to sort of be mean and make into one question, because they do, I think, essentially get to the same point. They're both from YouTube, and the first one is from Sylvia Corta, who asked, have you identified any change in the behavior of zoo animals as their sound environment decreased, I would add perhaps, due to the lack of visitors because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then also whether you think that might be positive or negative for them. And then sort of along the same lines, Maynard Clark asked something which I found interesting, was, has face masking contributed to silent sound walks? And sort of to add mine in that as well, I feel like I've also been noticing people perhaps saying hello less on the sidewalks when you pass them, and maybe sort of squinting their eyes more to dramatize the smile, sort of less acoustic exchanges between people. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on those two questions as well.
Yeah. So the project, the project both was and wasn't impacted heavily by COVID. It was sort of coming to an end when the pandemic, the active research part of the project was sort of coming to an end at the time that COVID hit. And so COVID, of course, changed sound environments across the world in a very major way. And, you know, in some ways makes our findings less relevant, and in some ways makes them important to bear in mind as we reconstruct our sound environments post-COVID, and as we think about the kind of behaviors we might want to encourage or discourage. So it's important to point out that both the zoos that were involved in the project were impacted very heavily by COVID. So Paynton Zoo permanently closed one of its sort of sister exhibits in Torquay. I believe it's called the Living Coasts it's an attraction called Living Coasts. They were obliged to close that permanently as a consequence of the loss of income they experienced during the epidemic. Bristol Zoo, the site at which all our sort of research was conducted, has been obliged to completely close its Clifton site. So that's the site that I showed you the map of earlier in the presentation. And they will be closing that permanently over the next few years. And there's lots of debate in the local press about what should happen to that site. It might become a housing development, it might become something else. But Bristol Zoo has another site on the outskirts of the city that they are looking to expand and grow, and to which they've suggested that not a lot of their animals will be transferred. So major impacts. And we didn't conduct research during that period. But the reports that I hear from sort of keepers and people I know who are closely involved in the zoos are that all kinds of different. There have been all kinds of different sort of impacts on behaviour from the absence or the reduction in visitors. So several people have mentioned zoo animals sort of missing. Particularly primates sort of missing or being perplexed by the lack of visitors. At the same time, there have been stories, particularly in the popular press, about unexpected births of animals or animals reproducing unexpectedly, presumably because of the lack of visitors, sort of reducing stress levels or creating environments that might be more conducive to their reproduction. I think that I could go on about this, but I guess that what I feel is the really important thing is that zoos assess what might have been good about the change in the auditory culture of the zoo during COVID. Are there aspects of the sound environment, perhaps the quiet, that they'd like to keep, or that they'd like to encourage? Are these things that they'd like to stress the importance of as visitors start to return? So what I think is that this really major interruption in sonic normality has to be an opportunity for us to sort of reflect on what we want zoos to sound like. And this is one of the important points that comes in at the end of the article we've produced on these listening to the zoo visits. Bearing in mind what visitors have said, especially, might quiet actually be a really valuable thing to preserve for zoos? Might it be a way for them to display different dimensions of their collections? Might it be a way for them to reassess what they want zoo visiting culture to be, I suppose? Does that?
Yeah, that's great. There's another question, but just sort of what you said now, sort of the future of zoos in a way, brought forth the question as well, again, selfishly for me.
Yeah.
But there's, I'm forgetting the word now, but sort of these projections. I feel like I saw somewhere there was a new type of zoo where they aren't, having captive live animals, but rather projecting images and sort of 3D images, I'm forgetting the word now, of animals. And I sort of wonder, because that's very heightened on visuals, of course, and what your thoughts are on that in relation to sound, like if they would sort of artificially incorporate sound into that, or if you think that would just be absent and people would be happy just watching, or how you think that might. It's a bit off of your research, but I just sort of popped into my mind if that's something that's been.
No, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because one of the theories as to what they might do with the old Clifton Zoo site is to make it into precisely one of these, a sort of digital 3D experience. And I know that a lot of zoos are reappraising whether they actually need live animals at all, which again is a very, is a really intriguing development. I mean, I think sound will be an important part of that, because in order to create the sort of really sort of overwhelming and sort of engrossing experiences that they want to produce through VR, sound is going to be an important part of making that happen. My real thoughts on that are just that, I hope that however sound is used, it'll be used really thoughtfully, with care and attention to detail and context, and with the goal of stimulating reflection in mind. So I actually feel that sort of some of the findings and important messages that have emerged from this project really need to be sort of borne in mind as if and when zoos take this turn and move towards being more sort of digital and virtual experiences. I don't think sound becomes less important, and I don't think the way that sound is treated, presented, and the way that attention is directed to sound becomes less important, maybe even become more important in that eventuality.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. I'm really curious to see how that develops in general with human animal interactions. This move away from, you see it in animals working in therapy as well. We have a question from, I think that's Sean, also from University of Exeter. They asked, did any children participate in your sound walks? If yes, can you expand on how they responded? I wonder if animal calls are also consumed along with the visual, especially for children.
Yeah, so no, we didn't include children in the listening visits because we felt that some of the exercises were too demanding, and we thought they probably wouldn't be able to cope with what we were trying to do, basically. We weren't sure. And we wanted to create a space where people could actually think, and we thought that would be more challenging were children to be involved, particularly if they were if the adults were in parental roles or childcare roles. So I think that would be a really important opportunity. I know that we organised as part of the project a workshop with people working in zoo education centres in various zoos across the UK, and they talked a lot about how sound and listening are useful and are used in their educational work, about how attending to animal calls and other animal sounds is an important part of what they do. We also conducted a whole series of interviews with members of the education department at Paignton Zoo, thinking about their use of sound in environmental education sessions. And it was we got a whole very varied sort of picture. But one of the things that emerged during the conversations with the education department at Paignton in particular was that they were really keen on the use of biofacts. So these are objects sort of derived from animals like, I don't know, a rhino horn, a snake skin, teeth of various kinds that children can handle and with which they can have some kind of direct tactile involvement. And they said, we do encourage them to sort of imitate animal calls and animal sounds at times, but essentially they were saying that sounds as artifacts, if you can call them that, as objects, questionable whether you can really call a sound an object, but are much sort of harder. They're harder to find, they're harder to contextualize, they're harder to use in the classroom environment. And so there was this kind of, what I call sonophobia, sort of fear of sounds to some extent or at least that was a sort of something that sort of emerged from that, from those discussions. And that obviously taking children around the zoo to listen to animal sounds, well, it's unpredictable. Animals don't always make sounds, just as they don't always appear visually. So basically there's a sort of, I got the impression from the Paignton Education Department with whom we spoke at some length, Adam Reed conducting all of those interviews actually, but my sense from him is that they did use sound, but they had this sort of wariness around its use. So sound presented particular issues, often practical issues, in terms of its use in the classroom. Although we have heard from other zoo education departments about a whole range of creative uses of sound. So I can't give a very easy and sort of succinct answer to that question, I'm afraid. But the answer is really that I think doing these kinds of exercises with children will be an interesting next step.
Yeah, I can really see a lot of research coming off of this, and then that sort of acting as a quite groundbreaking, perhaps we can use that word, springboard for future research and all in that area.
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah. Yeah. I sort of on the note of sound as objects and whether we can call them that, I think one of the things that stuck with me sort of on a more personal note here, perhaps from your module on bioacoustics, was this idea of, and I forget which context you brought it up in, but acoustic fossils, to sort of maybe like, can we track how these soundscapes change over time? And I wonder if that's something that you've perhaps thought of in this research, or sort of on your own with zoos, if that's something that is worth doing, or are people doing that? What might be gained from that, and so on.
Yeah, well, you know, I feel that particularly with regards to the Clifton site in Bristol, I'm in the process of what we're trying to do really is create an acoustic fossil, you know, create a sort of detailed record of this sound environment that's about to undergo in the next couple of years this very dramatic change, and sort of documenting that, you know, this area that sort of has been a zoo for nearly 200 years and, you know, has sounded in this particular way at this particular moment in time, you know, is no longer going to sort of be in existence, and it's going to kind of gradually shift and change, as it always does, of course. There's no stasis in the zoo. Things are always moving around. Buildings are being changed, enclosures are being changed, animals are moving in, animals are being moved out. You know, it's a constant process of flux, but there's going to be a more dramatic shift happening sort of imminently. So I think, you know, really what we're in the process of doing is documenting this and detailing this, what is about to become an acoustic fossil. But I'm really interested in other projects too that look to sort of recreate sound environments of the past, that look to imagine what extinct animals might sound like. Something that I notice sort of my kids who are crazy about dinosaurs do all the time. Imagine animals, you know, dinosaur sound. You know, I find that all really sort of interesting as an aspect of bioacoustics, I suppose. But yeah, I can't say I've sort of delved into that myself, except in the process of doing exactly what we're doing now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was also, I think, a really fascinating area that isn't perhaps getting as much attention, because I don't think we really acknowledge sound as something that we can really track in that sense, or at least not those of us who aren't in sound studies and so on. But yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Tom Rice, for this really wonderful talk and discussion that it brought forth. We were just about making time. There were a couple more questions, but I would just invite you all, as Dr. Tom Rice mentioned, to just email him directly afterwards if you like. Thank you. Yeah, I think we can put the email again, Rebecca, if you'd like, into the chat. Thank you also to those of you attending and being here with us today. It was a real pleasure, especially on YouTube. We had quite a large crowd with some good conversations happening there. I invite you to visit the Animals and Biodiversity Think Tank Program's Facebook group, and also the Twitter, and links to which you'll find in the chat as well, to just continue this conversation, as well as be informed of future events in a really wide range of disciplines that you might find interesting. You will also find a link to the Think Tank Program's website in the chat, which is hosted by the Global Research Network. So please do just take a look at the other Think Tank programs as well, and consider becoming a member if you like. So I hope to see you again at our future events. Thank you again very much, Dr. Tom Rice, for this talk. And I hope you all have a good evening or morning.